In the quiet town of Washington County, Arkansas, what started as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a high-speed chase that no one saw coming. Corporal Brett Thompson, a seasoned deputy, spotted an erratic driver on Highway 412, unaware that he was about to be pulled into a life-or-death standoff. But before we jump into this heartfelt story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss another uplifting tale. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the rolling hills of Washington County, Arkansas, casting long shadows across Highway 412 as Corporal Brett Thompson cruised west in his white sheriff's cruiser. At 35, Brett was a steady hand on the wheel, broad shoulders under his pressed uniform, brown eyes scanning the road with a quiet vigilance honed by a decade on the force. The Ozark landscape stretched around him, pine-dotted ridges, patches of scrub fading into twilight, the air crisp with November's edge. His radio hummed low, dispatch chatter a familiar drone, his day winding toward routine. A few speeding tickets, a wellness check, home to his wife, Sarah, and their 6-year-old son, Ethan, by supper. Ahead, a green Saturn caught his eye, its dented frame weaving slightly, speeding up to 65 in a 55 zone, then easing back, erratic but subtle. Brett squinted, his instinct prickling, and flipped on his dash cam, the red light blinking as he radioed in. Unit 214, Green Saturn, possible impaired driver, westbound 412 near mile 72. He eased closer, lights flashing but siren off, expecting a quick stop. A tired driver, maybe a busted taillight. Inside the Saturn, Luis Cobos gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale against his tan skin, his dark hair slick with sweat under a frayed cap. At 29, Luis was a live wire, eyes darting, jaw tight, a jittery energy buzzing through him, fueled by a sleepless night and a baggie of meth tucked in his pocket. Beside him, Tammy Pierce sat rigid, her thin frame swallowed by a hoodie, her blonde hair tangled from the wind whipping through the cracked window. At 25, she was Luis's shadow, loyal but fraying, her blue eyes flicking nervously between him and the rearview mirror where Brett's lights pulsed. "Luis, just pull over," she said, her voice low, trembling with an edge she couldn't hide. "He's gonna keep following." Luis smirked, a crooked twist of his lips, his foot teasing the gas. 60, then 50, then 65 again. "Relax, Tam. He's just fishing. I ain't stopping for no ticket." His words were sharp, laced with a bravado that didn't match the tremor in his hands. Brett tightened his grip on the wheel, the Saturn's game tugging at his calm. "Come on, buddy, don't make this hard," he muttered, flipping the siren on. A short whoop, then steady wail. The green car slowed to 40, its brake lights flaring red, and Brett exhaled, easing off the gas, expecting compliance. But Luis glanced back, his smirk widening into something feral, and slammed the accelerator, the Saturn lurching forward, engine whining as it hit 70 miles per hour. "Luis, what the hell?" Tammy snapped, her hands gripping the seat, her heart pounding as the road blurred past. Pine trees, a rusted barn, a pickup veering aside with a honk. "Unit 214, suspect vehicle accelerating, westbound, passing mile 73, Brett radioed, his voice steady but his pulse quickening, the chase snapping awake. He pushed the cruiser to 65, then 70, keeping pace, the Saturn's taillights a green smudge in the dusk. "Non-compliant, possible 10 to 55. Request backup." Dispatch crackled back. 10-4, units en route. But Brett's focus stayed locked ahead, the road narrowing as it curved past a gas station, its neon sign flickering in the fading light. This wasn't routine anymore. Something was off, a shadow lurking in the driver's play, and Brett's gut tightened, years of instinct whispering trouble. Inside, Luis laughed, a short, jagged sound, his eyes glinting with a mix of thrill and panic. "See? He's got to catch me first," he said, his voice pitching high, his foot heavy on the gas as the speedometer nudged 75. Tammy's nails dug into the upholstery, her breath shallow. "You're gonna get us killed, stop it, Luis." He ignored her, his mind racing. Cops meant jail. Jail meant facing the warrants he'd dodged, the meth they'd find. He wasn't going back, not this time. The Saturn swerved, tires humming, a dangerous dance with the law he'd started without a plan. Brett kept steady, his lights painting the road red and blue. the distance holding at 200 feet. "He's toying with me," he murmured, his jaw clenching as the Saturn slowed again. 50 miles per hour, then surged to 80, dust kicking up as it grazed the shoulder. "What's your game, pal?" He'd seen runners, drunks, thieves, but this felt different, erratic, like a fuse burning toward something he couldn't yet see. The highway stretched west, traffic thinning as dusk deepened, the chase stretching into tense minutes, 3, 4, each second a thread pulling tighter. Twilight bled into the Ozark Hills as Highway 412 stretched west from Silver Springs, its asphalt a dim ribbon under the fading November sky. Corporal Brett Thompson gripped the wheel of his sheriff's cruiser, his lights flashing red and blue, siren wailing as he trailed a green Saturn now pushing 80 miles per hour. At 35, Brett's calm was fraying. His brown eyes narrowed, his jaw tight, the chase stretching past 5 minutes since Luis Cobos had floored it, turning a routine stop into a pulse-pounding hunt. The Saturn's taillights flickered ahead, weaving through sparse traffic, a pickup pulling aside, a sedan honking, as dust trailed its reckless path. Inside the Saturn, Luis hunched forward, his dark hair plastered with sweat under his cap, his tan hands trembling on the wheel. At 29, he was a live wire sparking, meth buzzing in his veins, paranoia clawing his mind, his foot heavy on the gas as the speedometer nudged 85. "They ain't got me yet," he muttered, his voice a jagged rasp, a wild grin twitching on his lips. Beside him, Tammy Pierce clung to the passenger seat, her thin frame rigid, her blonde hair whipping in the wind from the cracked window. At 25, she was trapped in his chaos, her blue eyes wide with fear, her hands digging into the torn upholstery. "Luis, stop this!" she shouted, her voice cracking over the engine's whine. "You're gonna crash us!" "Shut up, Tam, I'm handling it," Luis snapped, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror where Brett's cruiser loomed, a relentless shadow 200 feet back. He swerved left, then right, testing the Saturn's limits, tires squealing as he cut around a slow-moving van, its driver cursing out the window. Tammy's breath hitched, her stomach lurching with each jolt. "You're crazy! He's not backing off!" she pleaded, her words drowned by the roar as Luis pushed the speed to 90, the car shuddering, its frame rattling like it might split apart. She'd seen him high, seen him fight, but this, running from a cop with no plan, was a ledge she hadn't imagined he'd leap off. Brett kept pace, his cruiser steady at 85 miles per hour, his radio crackling as he updated dispatch. "Unit 214, suspect vehicle westbound 412, mile 75. Speeding, erratic, still non-compliant." His voice held firm, but his pulse thrummed, adrenaline sharpening his focus. "Backup ETA?" he asked, his eyes locked on the Saturn's green blur. 5 minutes, Unit 733 closing from Springdale," dispatch replied, a lifeline he clung to as the road curved past a shuttered bait shop, its sign swaying in the wind. "He's running blind," Brett murmured, his hands flexing on the wheel, the chase a thread pulling tighter with every mile. 6 minutes now, then 7. Luis laughed again, a short, manic burst, his mind a tangle of defiance and dread. "He wants a game? I'll give him one," he said, his foot easing off, the Saturn dropping to 70, then surging back to 90, a taunting dance Brett couldn't ignore. Warrants loomed, assault, possession, jail a cage he'd clawed out of once, vowing never again. The meth in his pocket burned, a secret he'd killed to keep, his paranoia whispering the cop knew, was closing in. "Luis, please." Tammy's voice rose, a sob breaking through. "You're scaring me. Stop." He shot her a glare, his grin fading. "You're out if you can't handle it," he growled, his words a threat she didn't yet grasp. The highway dipped, traffic thinning as dusk deepened, the road flanked by scrub and skeletal trees. Brett's lights painted the Saturn's rear, his siren a steady wail cutting the quiet, his mind racing, drunk, high, armed. He'd stopped runners before, but Luis's play felt different. A fuse burning toward an end he couldn't see. "Unit 214, suspect slowing, mile 76, he radioed, hope flickering as the Saturn eased to 60, its brake lights flaring. But Luis smirked, his foot slamming down again, the car lurching to 95, dust billowing as he veered onto a gravel turnoff, tires crunching, the chase twisting off the highway's straight path. "Damn it!" Brett cursed, swinging the cruiser right, gravel pinging off the undercarriage as he followed, the road narrowing, ruts and rocks jolting his frame, the Saturn 150 feet ahead. "He's off 412, gravel road, westbound," he barked into the radio, his speed dropping to 50, then 60, the terrain testing his control. Tammy's scream pierced the Saturn's roar. "Luis, stop!" as the car fishtailed, her hands clawing the dash. Luis ignored her, his eyes glinting with a plan, the gravel stretching into a secluded stretch, trees closing in. "You want to ride, Tam? Ride this," he said, his voice low, menacing, as he slammed the brakes, the Saturn skidding to a halt, dust swirling in the headlights. The gravel road off Highway 412 swallowed the last light of November 11th, 2018, its ruts and dust cloaking Washington County in a deepening twilight. Corporal Brett Thompson eased his sheriff's cruiser to a stop, 100 feet from where Luis Cobos' green Saturn had screeched to a halt moments ago, its engine still growling, a predator idling in the gloom. At 35, Brett's steady calm was a thin veneer now, his brown eyes narrowed behind the windshield, his hand resting on his holster, his pulse a steady drum as the scene locked into focus. Tammy Pierce stumbled south through the scrub, her blonde hair a faint blur in the dust, her sobs echoing as she fled the car Luis had shoved her from. "Unit 214, suspect stopped, gravel road, mile 77, Brett radioed, his voice tight but controlled, his breath fogging in the cooling air as he cracked his door. "Female passenger out, walking southbound off Steel Road, I'm approaching." Dispatch crackled back. 10-4, back up 3 minutes out. But 3 minutes felt like a lifetime as the Saturn's driver's door swung open, Luis stepping out, his silhouette sharp against the headlights. At 29, Luis was a coiled spring, dark hair matted under his cap, tan face slick with sweat, his eyes glinting with a wild, meth-fueled edge. His right hand gripped a .38 revolver, its barrel catching the cruiser's lights, a glint of steel that froze Brett's breath. "Step out slow, hands up," Brett shouted, sliding from his seat, his boots crunching gravel as he took cover behind the door, his Glock drawn but low. Luis smirked, a crooked twist of his lips, his left hand raised mockingly, the gun steady in his right. "You want to dance, cop?" he called, his voice a jagged taunt, his body swaying slightly, high, unsteady, dangerous. Brett's grip tightened, his training kicking in. Assess, de-escalate, survive. "Drop the weapon, now!" he barked, his tone firm, cutting through the wind rustling the pines. Tammy, 50 feet south, spun at the shout, her hands flying to her mouth. "Luis, no!" Her cry a plea lost in the tension. Luis laughed, a short manic burst, his eyes darting. Brett's cruiser, the road, the trees, his mind a haze of paranoia and bravado. Warrants, jail, the meth in his pocket. He wasn't going back. Not like this. "You don't get it, man, I'm free," he yelled, his voice pitching high, his gun hand twitching. Brett ducked lower, his radio alive. "Unit 214, suspect armed, handgun visible." His heart slamming as he gauged the distance, 150 feet, too close for comfort, too far for a clean shot. "Luis Cobos, drop it. I don't want to shoot you," he called, his words a lifeline he hoped Luis would grab, but the glint in those eyes said otherwise. Tammy staggered back, her sneakers catching on roots, her voice rising. "Why's he doing this?" "Stop." She dropped to her knees, dust coating her jeans, her hands up as if to shield herself from the madness unfolding. Luis ignored her, his focus locked on Brett, his smirk fading into a snarl. "You think you're tough?" he spat, his gun hand jerking up, the barrel leveling, a split-second warning Brett caught too late. "Jesus! Gun!" he yelled, diving left as the first shot cracked, a muzzle flash slicing the dusk, the bullet pinging off the cruiser's hood, gravel spitting near his boots. Brett rolled, his Glock snapping up, instinct overriding thought. 2 rounds fired, sharp and deliberate, dirt kicking up near Luis's feet. "Drop it!" he roared, his voice raw, adrenaline flooding as Luis ducked behind the Saturn, another shot ringing out, crack embedding in a pine 10 feet right. Tammy screamed, curling into a ball. "Stop, please!" her terror a counterpoint to the chaos. Luis popped up, firing again. Crack, crack, wild, erratic, bullets whizzing past Brett's head, one shattering the cruiser's side mirror. Brett returned fire. 3 shots, measured, one grazing the Saturn's fender, the air thick with cordite and dust. Luis, 29, had ducked behind his car, a meth-fueled shadow, dark hair matted, tan face twisted in a snarl, firing back erratic and wild, his shots pinging off pines, whizzing past Brett's head. Tammy Pierce, 25, knelt 50 feet south, her blonde hair tangled in the wind, her screams, "Stop, please!" A desperate thread lost in the chaos, her hands shielding her face as bullets flew. Brett's training held. Aim, breathe, fire. His Glock barking 3 more times, one grazing the Saturn's fender, another thudding into its rear door. "Drop it, Luis!" he'd roared, his voice a lifeline swallowed by the roar of Luis's next shot. Crack, embedding in the cruiser's hood, inches from Brett's shoulder. 53 seconds stretched eternal. Luis popping up, firing twice more, wild arcs of light in the dusk. Brett answering with 2 shots, one sparking off the gravel, the other missing as Luis dove back into the driver's seat. The Saturn's engine had roared then, tires spinning, and Luis tore off, leaving dust and silence in his wake. Now, Brett stood, his chest heaving, his Glock still raised as the Saturn vanished west, its growl fading into the pines. "Unit 214, shots fired, suspect fleeing westbound, gravel road," he shouted into his shoulder mic, his voice shaking, the adrenaline crashing as he scanned the scene. Gravel crunched under his boots, his eyes darting to Tammy, crumpled in the dirt, her sobs a broken rhythm. "I don't know what he's doing." Brett lowered his gun but kept it ready, his pulse thundering as he approached, his shadow long in the cruiser's headlights. "Stay there. Hands up," he ordered, his tone firm but edged with concern, his free hand waving her still. Tammy looked up, her blue eyes wide with terror, her thin frame trembling under her hoodie. "Are you hit? You okay?" Brett asked, his voice softer now, his gun dipping as he scanned her. No blood, no wounds, just raw fear. I'm just scared," she choked out, her hands shaking as she raised them higher, dust coating her jeans. "He pulled a gun on me. I swear I don't know why." Brett holstered his Glock, his breath steadying, his mind racing. 53 seconds, 8 shots between them. No hits, a miracle in the hail of lead. "I need units now," he radioed again, his voice steadying. "Suspect armed, fleeing. White male, 20s, green Saturn." He knelt beside Tammy, his hand gentle but firm on her shoulder. "You're safe. Stay down," he said, his eyes flicking to the road, the night swallowing Luis's trail. "Why'd he pull a gun on me?" she sobbed, her voice cracking, her hands dropping to her lap. I don't know." Brett shook his head, his jaw tight. "We'll figure it out. Right now, I need you calm." He stood, pulling cuffs from his belt, his training overriding the chaos. "I'm putting you in cuffs. I don't know what I'm dealing with," he said, his tone apologetic as he secured her wrists, her sobs quieting into shudders. The cruiser's radio crackled. "Unit 733, ETA 2 minutes. Backup closing. A lifeline in the silence." Brett scanned the road, his hands steady now, his mind replaying each shot. Luis's wild aim, his own measured fire, the miracle of no blood spilled. "I'm good," he muttered, more to himself, his voice a whisper as he guided Tammy to her feet, her sneakers scuffing the gravel. "Do you need help?" he asked, glancing at a distant farmhouse, its porch light flickering on, a figure peering out. "Stay in your house," he called, his voice carrying, his focus split. Luis gone, Tammy here, the chase far from over. Tammy's eyes met his, her fear raw, unguarded. He's not right," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a clue Brett tucked away as sirens wailed closer, lights flashing through the trees. He nodded, his hand on her arm, guiding her to the cruiser's rear door. "We'll get him," he said, his tone resolute, the dust settling around them, silence reclaiming the road. The shootout's echo lingered, 53 seconds of chaos. A standoff ended but unresolved, Luis's flight a spark reigniting the hunt, and Brett standing in its wake, steady but shaken, the night stretching dark and uncertain before him. The night swallowed Washington County, Arkansas, as November 11th, 2018 stretched past 8 p.m., the Ozark Hills cloaked in a chill that seeped through the pines. Luis Cobos tore west in his green Saturn, the gravel road from his shootout with Corporal Brett Thompson fading into backroads, ruts and twists he navigated with a meth-addled fury. At 29, Luis was a fraying fuse, dark hair matted under his cap, tan hands slick on the wheel, his .38 revolver rattling on the passenger seat where Tammy Pierce had sat minutes ago. The Saturn's engine whined, pushing 70 miles per hour, its headlights slicing the dark, his mind a storm of paranoia and defiance. Cops behind, jail ahead, freedom a delusion he chased through the night. Back on the gravel road, Brett stood by his cruiser, its hood pocked with bullet marks, his brown eyes tracking the horizon where Luis had vanished. At 35, he was steady but shaken, his uniform dusty, his Glock holstered, his breath fogging as he guided Tammy into the rear seat, her cuffed hands trembling. Unit 214, suspect fled west, green Saturn, armed, he radioed, his voice firm despite the adrenaline's echo. Sirens wailed closer. Unit 733, Deputy Carlos Ortiz, rolling in with lights flashing, followed by Springdale PD units alerted to the gunfire. "He's not done," Brett muttered, his jaw tight, handing Tammy off to Carlos. "Keep her secure," before climbing back into his cruiser, the hunt reigniting. Luis veered onto a paved county road, tires screeching as he hit 80 miles per hour, the Saturn shuddering, its frame groaning under the strain. His eyes darted, mirrors empty, then flashing with distant lights. His breath ragged, the meth in his pocket a burning secret, his gun a weight he clutched like a lifeline. "They ain't taking me," he growled, his voice a rasp, his mind replaying the shootout, bullets missing, Tammy's screams. A high he rode into recklessness. The road bent toward a rural intersection near Springdale. Stop signs ignored, a gas station's glow flickering ahead, its lot empty save for a lone trucker pumping diesel. Brett trailed 3 miles back, his cruiser joined by Carlos and 2 Springdale units, 4 sets of lights cutting the night, speeds topping 75 miles per hour. Unit 214, suspect westbound County Road 19, ETA to Springdale 5 minutes, he radioed, his hands steady, his mind sharp despite the ache in his shoulder from diving for cover. Sheriff Laura Hayes' voice crackled through. "All units, box him in, armed and dangerous, proceed with caution." The net tightened, Springdale PD ahead, Washington County behind, a trap Luis couldn't outrun, though he didn't see it yet, his focus locked on the road, the gun, the dark. Luis hit the intersection, Highway 265. A 4-way stop near a shuttered feed store, its windows reflecting his headlights as he swerved through, tires screaming. A Springdale cruiser loomed ahead, lights flashing, blocking northbound, and Luis slammed the brakes, the Saturn fishtailing to a stop, gravel spitting from the shoulder. He leapt out, .38 in hand, his cap tumbling off, his eyes wild as he fired, crack, crack, bullets pinging off the cruiser's grill, glass shattering as the officer ducked. "Get back!" Luis yelled, his voice a frantic snarl, spinning as Brett's unit roared in from the east, Carlos and another from the south, boxing him in a triangle of light and steel. "Drop the weapon!" Brett shouted, slamming his door open, Glock drawn as he took cover, his voice echoing over sirens. Luis swung the gun, crack, firing at Brett's cruiser, a bullet thudding into the door, another whizzing into the night. Carlos fired back, 2 shots low, dirt exploding near Luis's feet, while Springdale's officer, Jenna Hayes, no relation to the sheriff, loosed 3 rounds, 1 grazing the Saturn's hood. "Down! Now!" she barked, her voice sharp, her stance steady behind her door. Luis stumbled, his gun hand shaking, meth and exhaustion fraying his edge. 5 shots fired, wild and desperate, hitting nothing but metal and air. Brett advanced, his Glock trained. "Luis Cobos, drop it or you're done." His tone a steel thread cutting the chaos. Luis spun, firing once more, crack, missing wide, the bullet burying in a pine, and Brett fired back. 2 shots, 1 clipping Luis's left arm, blood blooming on his sleeve. He yelped, the .38 clattering to the asphalt, his knees buckling as he clutched the wound, his defiance crumbling. "Hands up, now!" Carlos roared, closing in, cuffs out, while Jenna flanked right, her gun steady. Luis sank, his breath a hiss. All right. His hands rising, blood dripping, the fight draining as deputies swarmed. Brett holstered his Glock, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Luis, cuffed, cursing, hauled to Carlos's cruiser. "Suspect down, armed male, wounded, in custody," he radioed, his voice steadying, the second standoff ending in a blur of shouts and sirens. Springdale's medics rolled in, patching Luis's arm, Non-fatal, a graze. His snarls fading to mutters as they loaded him up. Brett leaned against his cruiser, its door pocked with new scars, his hands trembling now, the night's weight settling. "He's off the road," he said to Carlos, his voice low, relief mingling with exhaustion as Tammy's words, "He's not right," echoed, a puzzle piece for later. The Washington County Detention Center loomed gray and squat under a cold November sky, its concrete walls a fortress of silence 3 days after Luis Cobos' chaotic run on November 11, 2018. Inside cell block C, Luis sat on a steel bunk, his left arm bandaged from the graze he'd taken in the second shootout, his tan skin sallow under flickering fluorescent lights. At 29, he was a shadow of the wild man who'd fired on deputies. Dark hair matted, eyes sunken from meth withdrawal, his cap gone, his bravado stripped by the clang of bars. The .38 was evidence now, the baggie of meth confiscated, his wrists raw from cuffs as he awaited trial. Assault on an officer, weapons charges, a stack of warrants he couldn't outrun. Luis leaned back, his head thudding against the wall, his breath shallow as withdrawal gnawed. Sweats, shakes, a fog he couldn't shake. "Should have kept driving," he muttered, his voice a rasp, his mind replaying the gravel road, the intersection, Tammy's screams. Across the cell, Rico Diaz watched him, a hulking figure at 32, shaved head, tattoos snaking up his arms, eyes narrow with a predator's glint. Serving time for assault, Rico paced the cramped space, his silence heavy, his gaze flicking to Luis like a wolf sizing prey. "You the guy shot at cops?" Rico asked, his voice low, a smirk tugging his lips. Luis nodded, wary. "Yeah, what's it to you?" Rico's smirk widened, a spark of trouble Luis didn't yet see. Outside in Silver Springs, Corporal Brett Thompson sat at his kitchen table, the clock ticking past midnight. At 35 he was steady but fraying, his uniform swapped for a flannel shirt, his brown eyes tracing the grain of the wood, a half-empty coffee mug cooling in his hands. The shootouts replayed in his mind, gravel spitting, bullets pinging, Luis's wild grin, a loop he couldn't pause. Sarah slept upstairs, Ethan's crayons scattered nearby, but Brett couldn't join them, his steady life rattled by 53 seconds of chaos and a second standoff that ended in blood. "He's locked up," he whispered, a mantra to quiet the tremor in his hands. The graze on Luis's arm a mark he'd left, a weight he carried. At the substation earlier he'd filed his report, pages of clipped detail, shots fired, suspect down, his voice steady for Sheriff Laura Hayes. "You did what you had to," she'd said, her gray eyes firm, her hand on his shoulder a rare comfort. But Brett saw the cruiser's scars, bullet holes, shattered glass, each a reminder of his near miss, a life spared by inches. "He could have hit me, or her," he told Deputy Carlos Ortiz over the radio log, his tone low. Carlos nodded. "Miracle nobody died out there." Brett agreed, but the miracle felt hollow. Luis's fate a shadow stretching beyond the bars, a story unfinished. Tammy Pierce slipped back into town, her thin frame hunched in a booth at the Dixie Diner, her blonde hair pulled tight, her blue eyes haunted by the gravel road. At 25 she was free. No charges, a witness, not a suspect. But guilt clung like damp air. She'd walk south as Luis fired, her screams unheard, her loyalty a chain she'd broken when he'd shoved her out. "He's not right," she'd told Brett. And now, sipping lukewarm coffee, she replayed it. His wild eyes, the gun, the meth she'd ignored too long. "I should have left sooner," she murmured, her voice a whisper lost in the diner's hum, her hands trembling as she traced a crack in the table. Released after questioning, Tammy had dodged the press, her name a footnote in the news. Girlfriend of suspect flees scene. Her story buried under Luis's chaos. She'd given deputies fragments. "He's been off. Drugs. Fights. I didn't know he'd snap." Now she worked graveyard shifts, flipping eggs, her tips barely covering rent, her mind stuck on Luis, locked up, wounded, a man she'd loved until he'd turned into a stranger. "You good?" a waitress asked, her tone kind. Tammy nodded, a lie she wore like her apron, her future a blank page she couldn't yet write. Back in the cell, Luis shifted, his bunk creaking, Rico's stare a weight he couldn't shake. "Heard you're tough," Rico said, cracking his knuckles, his voice a taunt. Luis shrugged, his energy sapped. Did what I had to. Rico stepped closer, his shadow looming. Tough don't mean much in here. Luis met his gaze, a flicker of defiance sparking. Jail was new, but fights weren't. His fists clenching despite the ache. Back off, he warned, his tone low, a thread of the old fire flaring, but Rico's smirk held, a promise of trouble brewing in the concrete silence. Brett drove past the detention center on patrol, his cruiser's lights off, his eyes lingering on its walls. Luis was inside, cuffed, charged, a threat contained. But the echo of gunfire lingered, a scar on his steady world. Tammy flipped a burger, her reflection dim in the diner's window, her life a quiet drift from Luis's storm. In cell block C, Rico paced, his eyes on Luis, attention coiling tight, a fuse neither saw burning toward its end. The night held them all, locked, adrift, watching. A fragile pause before the next break. The Washington County Detention Center stood stark under a slate-gray sky, its concrete walls muffling the late November chill that settled over Arkansas in 2018. Inside cell block C, Luis Cobos slouched on his bunk, his bandaged left arm aching from the graze he'd taken 2 weeks prior, his tan skin pale under the harsh lights. At 29, he was a ghost of the man who'd torn through the night, dark hair lank, eyes dulled by withdrawal, his defiance eroded by days of meth's absence and jail's grind. The air was thick with stale sweat and tension, the clang of bars a constant hum, his trial looming like a noose he couldn't dodge. Assault, weapons, a life unraveling in charges. Across the cell, Rico Diaz loomed, his bunk a perch he rarely used, his shaved head gleaming, tattoos curling up his thick arms like veins of ink. At 32, Rico was a predator, serving 6 years for aggravated assault, his eyes narrow, his silence a coiled threat. For days he'd watched Luis, his muttered bravado, his restless pacing, a spark waiting to ignite. "You're quiet today, tough guy," Rico said, his voice a low growl, cracking his knuckles as he stepped closer. Luis glanced up, his jaw tightening, a flicker of the old fire flaring. "Ain't in the mood," he rasped, his hands clenching, the cell's 8x10 walls shrinking around them. The spark came fast. A petty slight, Luis shifting Rico's blanket off the floor with a kick. A muttered, "Keep your crap out of my space." Rico's smirk vanished, his bulk lunging forward. "You don't touch my stuff." His fist slamming into Luis's jaw, a crack echoing off concrete. Luis stumbled, blood trickling from his lip, his instincts kicking in, street fights, bar brawls, a life of scrapping. He swung back, a wild hook catching Rico's cheek, but withdrawal slowed him, his strength sapped. "Back off," he snarled, his voice breaking as Rico grabbed his collar, slamming him against the wall, the bunk rattling. Guards down the hall chatted, their voices distant, the cell block's hum masking the scuffle, until it wasn't. Rico's hand dipped to his waistband, a shank flashing, crude, sharpened metal from a bed frame, hidden in his sleeve. "Tough don't mean shit here," he hissed, his eyes glinting as he drove it into Luis's side, a quick, brutal thrust. Luis gasped, blood blooming dark on his jumpsuit, his hands clawing at Rico's arm as he staggered, the shank twisting before Rico yanked it free. "Lights out, man," Rico spat, stepping back as Luis sank, his breath a gurgle, his eyes wide with shock, then dimming fast. The cell block erupted, Luis's body thudding to the floor, blood pooling, Rico pacing with a cold smirk, wiping the shank on his pant leg. "Hey, fight!" a neighboring inmate yelled, fists banging bars, the noise snapping guards into motion. Boots pounded, keys jangled. "Open C12!" The door sliding as 2 guards burst in, batons drawn. "Down now!" one barked, Rico dropping the shank, hands up, his smirk unshaken. Luis lay still, his chest heaving once, then stopping, blood spreading like ink, his fight snuffed out in a concrete cage. Across Silver Springs, Corporal Brett Thompson sat in the substation break room, a coffee cooling in his hands, the clock ticking past 2 p.m. At 35, he was steady again, his uniform crisp, his brown eyes tracing a report from the night's patrol, the shootout's a scar he'd stitched into duty. His phone buzzed. Sheriff Laura Hayes, her voice clipped. "Brett, Cobos is dead. Cellmate shanked him just now." He froze, the mug trembling, his mind flashing. Luis's wild grin, bullets pinging gravel, a man he'd cuffed now gone. "How?" he asked, his voice low, Hayes's reply grim. Fight turned ugly, fast. Guards found him cold. Brett exhaled, a weight lifting, then settling. Justice, but not his kind, a twist he hadn't seen coming. Tammy Pierce flipped pancakes at the Dixie Diner, her graveyard shift dragging, her blonde hair tied back, her blue eyes hollow under the fluorescent glow. At 25, she was a driftwood caught in Luis's wake, free, but tethered to his chaos. Her phone rang, an unknown number, a friend's voice breaking through. "Tam, Luis, he's dead. Jail fight." She dropped the spatula, grease splattering, her hands shaking as she sank onto a stool. "He's gone?" she whispered, tears welling, her mind a reel. His gun, her screams, the shove that freed her. "Yeah, cellmate got him," the voice said, and Tammy sobbed, a muffled wail into her apron. Relief, guilt, a tie severed by blood she hadn't spilled. At the detention center, Rico sat cuffed in a holding cell, his smirk fading as guards logged the shank, his charge escalating. Murder now, a life sentence looming. Brett drove past on patrol, his cruiser slowing, his eyes on the gray walls, a grim nod to the end of Luis's echo. Chaos contained, then extinguished. Tammy wiped her face, flipping a burger, her sobs quieting, a fragile step beyond his shadow. The cell block stilled, blood mopped, Luis's bunk empty, his final blow a silent ripple through a night that held no mercy. Early December 2018 draped Washington County, Arkansas, in a quiet frost, the Ozark Hills shimmering under a thin layer of ice as Silver Springs settled into a muted rhythm. The chaos of November 11th, Luis Cobos' wild run, the shootouts, his death in a jail cell, had faded into memory, its echoes lingering in the gravel roads and concrete walls that bore its scars. The green Saturn sat impounded, its bullet-pocked frame a relic of a night that had shaken the county, while the detention center stood unchanged, its gray bulk a silent witness to Luis's final blow. At 29, he was gone, his meth-fueled defiance snuffed out by Rico Diaz's shank, but his story rippled on, a cautionary thread woven into the town's fabric. Corporal Brett Thompson drove Highway 412, his sheriff's cruiser humming past mile marker 77, the gravel turnoff where Luis had fired on him now a quiet stretch under the morning sun. At 35, Brett was steady again, his uniform crisp, his brown eyes calm but carrying a new weight, the shootouts a scar he'd turned into strength. 2 weeks since Luis's death, he'd returned to patrol, his hands steady on the wheel, his Glock holstered with a ritual check, locked, secure, a lesson etched in muscle memory. At the substation, he led rookie training, his voice firm, "Stay sharp, every stop's a wild card." Sheriff Laura Hayes watched, her gray eyes approving, her new protocols, tighter pursuit rules, mandatory debriefs, a legacy of that night's chaos. Brett parked near the diner, his breath fogging as he stepped out, the cold biting his knuckles. Inside, he nodded to Tammy Pierce, her blonde hair tied back, her blue eyes softer now as she poured his coffee. At 25, Tammy was rebuilding, her graveyard shifts at the Dixie a lifeline after Luis's shadow lifted. "Heard about Luis," Brett said, his tone low, a bridge between them. She nodded, her hands steady on the pot. "Yeah, still sinking in." Her voice was quiet, her guilt easing, his gun, her screams, a past she'd survived. "You okay?" he asked, and she smiled, faint but real. Getting there. She'd rented a room above the diner, her tips stacking toward a GED, a step beyond the driftwood she'd been. The town healed in small ways. Highway 412 buzzed with its usual traffic, the gravel road unmarked but remembered, a story swapped over coffee at the diner, whispered in church pews. Sheriff Hayes met with the press, her voice steady. "We've tightened up, learned from it. No memorials for Luis, his name a footnote. Meth, guns, a jailhouse end." But the community turned inward, talks of mental health bubbling up at town halls. "He was lost," a pastor said, and heads nodded, a quiet shift from blame to understanding, a thread Tammy carried when she spoke to a youth group, her voice trembling. "Don't wait till it's too late." Brett's home glowed warm that night, Sarah stirring soup, Ethan coloring at the table, crayons sketching a cruiser, a hero's tale he'd heard from his dad. "You're back early," Sarah said, her smile soft, her hand brushing his. "Yeah, quiet shift," Brett replied, his voice lighter, the echo of gunfire fading behind Ethan's laugh. He'd faced Luis, survived Rico's aftermath, and found his steady ground. Patrols sharper, nights deeper, a man who'd stared down chaos and walked away whole. "You're okay?" she asked, and he nodded. "Better than okay." His scars a badge he wore with pride. Tammy flipped a burger, the diner's hum a comfort, her reflection clear in the window. No longer Luis's shadow, but her own shape taking form. "Order up," she called, her tone steady, her hands busy, her life a blank page she wrote with small, deliberate strokes. Work, study, a dream of nursing school flickering. A regular tipped her extra, "You're tougher than you look," and she smiled, a spark of resilience kindled. A woman stepping from the wreckage into light. Luis's death had cut her free, a brutal gift she turned into purpose, her sobs replaced by quiet resolve. At the detention center, Rico Diaz sat in solitary, his smirk gone, his trial pending, murder added to his ledger, a life sentence looming. The cell block hushed, Luis' bunk reassigned, his blood a memory scrubbed clean. Sheriff Hayes reviewed the case, her office warm with coffee's scent, her voice firm to Brett. "We move forward, stronger," he agreed, his steady hand steadier now. A lesson carved from gravel and steel. Chaos could strike, but resilience could rise. The town bore its echo. Talks, rules, a diner's quiet nights, a testament to survival. A whisper that even in madness, something enduring could grow. The sun dipped low, painting the hills gold. Highway 412 stretching west. A road that held its scars but rolled on. Brett drove home, his cruiser's hum a steady pulse. Tammy flipped her last order, and Silver Springs breathed, its people weaving hope from the threads of a night that could have broken them. Luis's trigger had fired its last shot, but its echo built something stronger. A community, a deputy, a woman, standing tall in the frost of a new dawn. As the dust settled on Highway 412, the echoes of that fateful night remained, a stark reminder of how split-second decisions can alter lives forever. Corporal Brett Thompson walked away from the chaos stronger, more vigilant, and more determined than ever to protect and serve. For Tammy Pierce, the night was a painful turning point, but also a second chance. A chance to break free from the shadows of her past and rebuild her life. Though Luis Cobos' choices led him down a dark path, his story serves as a powerful lesson. We are all given moments in life where we can choose a different direction. Some take that chance, others let it slip away. But no matter how difficult life becomes, there is always an opportunity for redemption, for change, for hope. Let this story be a reminder that even in the darkest moments, resilience can shine through. The choices we make today shape the lives we live tomorrow. And no matter how lost we may feel, it is never too late to turn things around. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength within us all.